The dust of rimrock tasted of alkali and fear. It swirled in the noon sun, a gritty haze kicked up by the frantic hooves of horses tied too hastily to the hitching posts. Inside the First Bank of Arizona, the air was thick with the scent of oiled steel and stale sweat. Tom Redhawk lay on the floor, the rough sawn planks pressing into his cheek, his hands bound tight behind his back with a length of coarse rope. He had come to town for salt blocks, canvass a simple trip. But the world had a way of turning simple things into chaos. 4 men, their faces hidden by dusty bandanas, moved with a brutal efficiency that spoke of long practice. Their leader, however, wore no mask. He stood by the teller's cage, his face pale and narrow, framed by dark, well-kept hair that seemed out of place amidst the grime. He wore a tailored coat over a silk vest, and his voice when he spoke was not the guttural bark of a common outlaw, but a cold, educated purr that cut through the whimpers of the other captives. "Patience, good people," he said, his eyes scanning the room with detached amusement. "A financial transaction of this nature requires a certain decorum." He was Silas Kane, a name that had begun to drift like a plague wind across the territory. Tom kept his head down, his focus narrowed to the rhythmic creak of the floorboards, the ragged breathing of the merchant beside him. Kane's men were stuffing canvas bags with banknotes and coin, but Kane himself seemed uninterested in the money. His gaze drifted, assessing until it settled on Tom. He moved with an unnerving grace, his polished boots making almost no sound. He stopped looming over Tom. "Well, what have we here? A son of the desert come to pay tribute to our temple of commerce." Tom said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence was his strongest shield. An Apache on the floor of a white man's bank was a target, nothing more. Kane knelt, his movements fluid as a cat's. His clean manicured fingers brushed against the worn leather cord around Tom's neck, a cord Tom never removed. With a delicate tug, he drew out the small object tucked beneath Tom's shirt. It was a silver locket tarnished with age, its surface etched with the faint image of a desert rose. Maria's. The only thing of hers he had left besides the land. How very touching. Kane murmured, his voice a silken threat. He examined the locket, his thumb tracing the worn engraving. A keepsake. A token of a love you never deserved. Tom's muscles went rigid. A cold fire ignited in his gut, a rage he had not felt in years. He met Kane's eyes. They were the color of a winter sky, pale and utterly devoid of warmth. "I give it back." Tom's voice was a low growl, rough from disuse. Kane smiled, a thin, cruel curve of his lips. He unfastened the clasp and slipped the locket from the cord. "A man like you," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was for Tom alone, "has no right to something so beautiful. Some men only know how to take, how to break, how to abandon what is precious." He stood pocketing the locket. Consider this a lesson in loss. The act was not random. It was precise, deliberate, a surgeon's cut aimed at the heart. While his men looted the vault, Silas Kane had robbed Tom of a memory. He had stolen the last tangible piece of his wife. The raid was over as quickly as it began. The outlaws mounted up their bags, heavy with the town's wealth. As they wheeled their horses toward the open country, Kane glanced back his eyes, finding Tom, who was now being helped to his feet by the bank teller. Kane offered a mock salute, the silver locket glinting for a moment in his hand, before he spurred his horse and vanished in a cloud of that same bitter dust. The townsfolk erupted in a babble of shock and outrage, but Tom heard none of it. He stood frozen, his hand at his empty collar, a hollow space where the locket had rested against his skin for 6 years. The money was gone. The bank was in chaos. But for Tom Redhawk, the only thing that mattered was the calculated cruelty of a man who knew his name, and the gaping wound that theft had torn open in his soul. Why the question echoed in the sudden profound silence of his loss, a question that promised a violent answer. The wind slid down off the high country like a knife, carrying with it the scent of pine resin and the memory of old snow. Tom Redhawk stood on the rise above his ranch house, the splintered wood of a fence post, digging into his calloused palm. From that vantage point, he could see everything he and Maria had built and everything he now held alone. The long, split-rail fences snaked across the unforgiving land like stitches holding a wound together. The neat corrals, the line of sheds hewn from pine, and beyond them, the skeletal face of the Mogollon Rim rising blue and sharp against the sky. It was a fine spread, a testament to relentless labor. But a ranch, no matter how well built, could not answer a man's voice at supper. It could not mend his shirt or share a bed. 3 weeks had passed since the robbery in Rim Rock, and the silence that had once been a familiar companion now pressed in, heavier laced with the venom of Silas Kane's parting words. The loss of the locket was a constant throbbing ache, a phantom limb he reached for a dozen times a day. He walked the perimeter of his fences, his boots sinking into the thawing soil. He talked to his horse, a stoic buckskin named Dust, his voice a low rumble. He knew me, Dust, or knew of me. The horse just flicked an ear. It was a one-sided conversation, but it was better than the crushing quiet. The silence was a presence, a weight that settled in his bones heavier with each passing year since Maria. She had died quick, too quick for a man to make sense of it. A corral beam gave way while she was helping him set a post. He remembered the sickening crack of wood, the cloud of dust remembered running to her side, his hands useless, his voice calling her name into the empty sky. It had been 6 years. He'd buried her beneath the lone oak on the hill, and with her, he'd buried the better part of himself. An old ranch hand, a wanderer named Jeb, had helped him clear the debris a week later. Funny thing, Jeb had mumbled, chewing on a piece of straw. This beam looks like it was scored, deliberately weakened. Tom had dismissed it, then lost in the fog of his grief, but now the memory returned with a chilling new clarity. Since that day, he had worked. He was Apache by birth and the son of a Chiricahua mother and a Mexican father, and labor was the one language he trusted. He broke more land, expanded the herd, put up barns Maria had only dreamed of. The neighbors few as they were respected the size of his operation, though respect did not mean acceptance. To them, he was still that Apache running stock on land they coveted. They kept their distance, and Tom did not seek them out. But a man alone could work himself into the ground and find nothing waiting at the end of the day but exhaustion. The encounter with Kane had shown him that. It wasn't just the locket. It was the targeted nature of the attack, the insinuation that he was unworthy. It stirred a deeper, older guilt, a shadow from a time even before Maria. A girl's face, pale and framed with blonde hair, flickered at the edge of his memory. A name whispered on the wind, Eleanor. A tragedy for which he'd always carried a vague, unsettling blame. He'd pushed it down for years, but Kane's words had dislodged it, a stone rolling in the dark. That was why, against all instinct, he had finally written the letter. He remembered the awkward scrape of pen against paper, his large, work-roughened hands struggling with the unfamiliar tool. He had written in plain words, the way Maria always said was best. I am looking for a wife. I am not rich, but the ranch is strong. Life here is hard but honest. I ask only for someone steady, willing to work, willing to share in what this land demands. In return, I give my word. I will provide, and I will keep faith. He sent the letter to a broker in Santa Fe, folded with more hope than he wanted to admit, and waited. What came back nearly broke that hope altogether. The first woman stepped down from the stage, looked once at his copper skin and the long, dark braid hanging down his back, and turned on her heel without a word. The second lasted 3 days before fleeing the endless chores and the solitude. The third stung worse. She was young, bright-eyed, and stayed one night before riding off with a neighboring rancher, a man with whiter skin and smoother talk. Tom did not chase them. He simply went about his chores, his heart a cold stone in his chest. Maybe the land was his only true wife. Maybe some men were not meant for companionship. And yet, when the next letter arrived, this one bearing the name Lily Jameson, he found himself reading it twice, then 3 times. She did not write flowery words. She did not ask about comforts or dresses. Her script was neat, her language direct. Mr. Redhawk, I have spent 10 years working in a textile mill in Kansas City, raising my younger siblings after our parents perished in a factory fire. They are grown now with families of their own. I find myself alone. I am 28 years old, unmarried, and tired of city smoke and the clatter of looms. I want a place where my labor means something lasting. I am not afraid of work. I ask only for honesty and a fair chance. Sincerely, Lily Jameson. Tom folded that letter carefully and tucked it into the pocket of his vest. For weeks afterward, he would take it out at night, run his thumb over the paper as though it held warmth and wonder. Would she be like the others? Would she see his heritage first and walk away? He told himself not to hope, but hope had a way of seeping into the cracks of a man's resolve. He sent his reply a single word, written beneath her address. Come. The morning Lily was due to arrive. Tom found himself pacing the yard, his boots cutting tracks in the frost. He had split wood until his arms ached, fixed hinges that did not need fixing anything to keep his hands busy. Finally, near noon, the creak of iron and the call of a driver echoed through the pines. Tom wiped his palms on his trousers and stepped out to meet the wagon, his breath rising in white clouds. His heart thudded hard enough to remind him he was still a man, not just a rancher, not just an Apache widower, but a man who longed for someone to share his fire. The supply wagon lumbered into the yard, its wheels groaning. The driver, old Jim Garrison, tipped his hat with a grin that showed more gaps than teeth. Got a passenger for you, Redhawk? He called, jerking a thumb toward the seat beside him. Reckon she's tougher than most riding up this road in winter. Tom's gaze shifted. The woman beside Jim was bundled in a plain wool coat, a scarf wound tight around her throat. She wasn't dainty. Her shoulders were square, her frame solid, built for labor. She looked out over the spread with a steady measuring eye, not wide with awe or pinched with fear. She was assessing it just as it was assessing her. She stepped down without waiting for a hand, her boots sinking into the frost-hardened soil. She turned to face Tom, and he saw a face marked not by youth, but by endurance. Dark hair was pinned neatly back, and her eyes were the color of riverstone, cool, direct, but not unkind. Mr. Redhawk? She asked. Her voice was practical with no false sweetness. Tom inclined his head. Ma'am, I'm Lily Jameson, she said. I've come as arranged. Welcome to the Rim. He managed the words, feeling stiff in his throat. It's a hard place. So am I, she replied, and for the first time, a flicker of something humor perhaps warmed her gaze. Jim unloaded a few parcels. Storms buildin' in the high country. You two make the best of it. With a wink, he climbed back aboard, leaving them in a sudden, profound silence. Let me take your bag, Tom said, breaking the quiet. I can manage, Lily replied, though she allowed him to lift it. It was heavy. She had not packed for show. He led her to the cabin. Inside, the fire glowed low in the hearth. The room smelled of pine smoke and the venison stew he'd prepared. It was a sturdy place, but the clutter of a man living alone was everywhere. Lily's gaze swept across the room, missing nothing. "You built this yourself," she stated, not a question. "Every log." "It's strong," she said, her hand brushing the edge of the rough-hewn table. "Good work." Her tone wasn't flattery. It was an acknowledgement from one worker to another, and it steadied him more than praise. He showed her to the small room he had prepared. The bed was narrow but clean, with quilts folded at the foot. Maria had made those quilts. He'd hesitated, then decided they belonged to the house, not just to a memory. Lily set her bag down, her expression unreadable. The meal passed in a halting quiet. Lily ate without complaint. Now and then her eyes flicked to the soot smudges on the hearth, the tools left scattered by the door. "You keep busy," she remarked at last. "There's always work. And little time for order," she added, her tone matter of fact. "A man alone gets by, but two together might do better." The words lingered between them, a proposition and a challenge. Later, as darkness pressed against the windows, she sat by the fire, mending a small tear in her glove, with precise practice stitches. Her hands moved without hesitation, the way his did with rope or rifle. She did not chatter or fidget. She worked as though work were the one constant she could trust. He stepped outside into the brittle night, the stars sharp and cold overhead. Inside that cabin was a woman who had crossed half the continent because of a letter he wrote in loneliness. She was built of hardship, same as he was. Whether that would bind them or break them, he did not yet know. He returned to the cabin. "Storm's coming," he said. "You'll hear it in the timbers tonight." "I've heard worse," she answered quietly. He nodded, his throat tight. As he lay awake on his narrow bed, listening to the wind gather in the pines, he could hear her moving softly in the next room. For the first time in years, the silence of winter did not feel absolute. A fragile flame of hope, unwelcome but alive, flickered in the darkness. By the second morning, the sky sagged with heavy gray clouds rolling down from the rim. The storm arrived not with a whisper, but a roar. The wind howled down the chimney, and snow began to fall thick as goose feathers, erasing the world outside. For 3 days, the blizzard did not ease. Snow piled high against the windows until daylight was a dim gray glow. The cabin became their entire world. The first day, Lily set about bringing order to his chaos. She reorganized the pantry, tutting over dried beans mixed with flour sacks. "You keep things like a man who never expects company," she said, her hands already busy. "That's mostly true," Tom replied from the hearth. "Well, you've got company now," she shot back, though her eyes softened. On the second day, the confinement began to fray their nerves. She grew restless, pacing the small room. She snapped at him when she found his boots dripping mud by the door. "Do you never think to wipe your feet?" Tom stiffened. Wasn't much point before. "There's a point now," she said, snatching them up to set them by the fire. He could have barked back, reminded her this was his house. But he sat quiet, listening to the storm and the sound of her bustling. It had been a long time since anyone cared whether his boots ruined a floor. By the third day, the tension broke and they began to talk. She told him of the mill, of the endless clatter of looms, the lint choking the air. She spoke of her siblings, of raising them on scraps and wages. "And then, it was just me," she said, her voice low. No one left to need me. That's when I knew I had to leave, or I'd wither like a rag on the line. Tom listened, and then he spoke of Maria, of her laughter of the day the beam broke, of how he had stood helpless. His voice cracked only once. I thought the land might fill the emptiness, he said, staring into the fire. But land can't speak back. It can't share the weight. Lily didn't touch him, but her gaze was steady. Then maybe the land isn't meant to carry it alone, she said. On the fourth morning, the storm relented. Tom shoved the door open against a massive drift and stepped into a world remade glittering sharp beneath a brittle sky. Lily stood beside him, her eyes wide. It's beautiful, she whispered. Tom found himself looking at her instead of the snow. It is, he agreed softly. They spent the day digging out the shared heavy labor, forging a silent pact between them. That evening, as they sat by the fire, she broke the quiet. You've kept this place alive alone for years. That's no small feat. Tom shook his head. Alive, maybe, not living. She studied him, then smiled faintly. Perhaps that can change. In the days after the thaw, a grim discovery soured their fragile peace. Tom found the small spring that fed their winter well, deliberately fouled a dead coyote thrown into it, its carcass rotting in the water. It was a malicious act, meant to sicken his stock or them. A few days later, while riding the southern fence line, he found it cut and 20 head of his best cattle missing. Just some low-life rustlers. Lily asked, her brow furrowed with worry as she helped him patch the wire. Maybe, Tom said, his jaw tight. Or maybe someone wants this land. Someone who thinks an Apache shouldn't have it. It was the most logical explanation. But as he examined the tracks left by the rustlers' horses, a cold knot formed in his stomach. The prints were shod with a distinctive iron, a crescent moon mark on the heel. It was the mark of a farrier in Prescott miles away. These weren't local opportunists. This was organized. This felt like the beginning of something much darker. As the snow melted and the land awoke to spring, Tom and Lily fell into a rhythm. He taught her to ride the rugged country, to read the tracks in the mud, to handle the heavy Winchester rifle. The first time she hit the tin can, he'd set on a fence post at 50 yards. She lowered the rifle with a triumphant grin. Seems I can learn more than darning socks, she said. Seems so, Tom replied, a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the sun. She in turn transformed the cabin. She stitched curtains, planted an herb garden in pots by the window, and filled the air with the scent of fresh bread. The house, once a shelter, was becoming a home. But the shadow of the attacks lingered. Tom rode the fences daily, his rifle always in its scabbard. The threats escalated. One night they woke to the smell of smoke. A pile of oil-soaked rags had been set against the north wall of the barn, a clear attempt at arson. They managed to douse the flames before they took hold, but the message was clear. This isn't about cattle anymore, is it? Lily said, her face pale in the moonlight, her hands gripping a water bucket. No, Tom said. This is about driving me out. Lily's presence was a strange comfort in the growing danger. She was not a woman given to hysterics. Her fear sharpened her senses, made her more vigilant. She learned to load the Winchester as quickly as he could, her hands steady. They became a team bound not by romance, but by a shared will to survive. With Lily's sharp eye helping, Tom started to piece things together. She noticed things he overlooked in his anger. A footprint near the barn that was too narrow for a common ranch hand's boot. A cigarillo butt, an expensive brand, dropped near the poisoned spring. Small things, but they didn't fit the profile of local ranchers or common rustlers. Whoever is doing this has money. Lily observed one evening, examining the cigarillo butt. And they're careless, because they think you're just a lone Apache who won't be believed. Tom had sent word to the sheriff in Rimrock, a weary man named Brody, but without proof, there was little he could do. "It's your word against the wind, Red Hawk," Brody had said not unkindly. "You find me a man, I'll lock him up. You bring me whispers, I can't do a thing." Tom knew he was on his own. He began tracking the men who watched his ranch from the high ridges. They were professionals, cautious and skilled, but Tom's Apache blood gave him an edge. He knew how to move through the skeletal landscape without a sound, how to read the story left in a bent twig or a displaced stone. He found their camp a well-hidden spot in a box canyon miles from his property. And there, tied to a picket line, was a handsome bay gelding with a crescent moon brand on its shod hoof. He waited until nightfall, moving like a ghost through the darkness. He overheard their conversation around a low fire. They spoke of Cain and the next phase. The name hit him like a physical blow. Silas Cain. It wasn't about the land. It had never been about the land. It was about him. He rode back to the ranch under the cold light of the stars, the pieces clicking into place. The robbery, the locket, the cryptic words, the escalating attacks. It was all connected. He told Lily everything. "We have to go to the sheriff," she said, her voice firm. With what the word of 2 hired guns in a canyon, Brody won't move. Tom's voice was grim. "No, I have to face him. I need to know why." He knew it was a risk, but the not knowing was a cancer eating at him from the inside. He found out Cain was using a dilapidated ranch stead south of Rimrock as a base. Leaving Lily with the Winchester and strict instructions not to open the door to anyone, Tom rode out at dawn. He found Cain on the porch of the old ranch house, cleaning a silver-inlaid revolver, looking as calm as if he were expecting him. His men were there, but they kept their distance watching. "Mr. Red Hawk," Cain said, not looking up from his task. "To what do I owe the pleasure have you come to beg for your trinket back?" "I've come for an answer." Tom said, his voice level, his hand resting near the Colt on his hip. "Why?" Silas Cain finally looked up, and his pale eyes were filled with a chilling, triumphant hatred. "Why? Because you have a debt to pay. A debt of blood." He stood the revolver, now assembled and resting lightly in his hand. "My name is not Cain. It is Thorne. Silas Thorne." The name meant nothing to Tom. He shook his head. "Does the name Eleanor Thorne mean anything to you?" Silas spat the words. "My younger sister. The girl you courted in Prescott 7 years ago. The girl you promised a future to before you cast her aside for that half-breed wife of yours." The memory hit Tom like a physical shock. Eleanor, the banker's daughter. Blonde hair, blue eyes, a fragile, hopeful girl. He had known her briefly. They had talked, shared a few dances at a town social. He'd been flattered by her attention, but his heart had already belonged to Maria. He had let her down gently, or so he had thought. "I never promised her anything," Tom said, his voice hoarse. "You gave her hope." Silas roared, his composure finally cracking. "And when you took it away, you destroyed her. She became a ghost wandering our house, until one day she wandered right off the edge of Verde Canyon. An accident, they called it. But I know the truth. You killed her as surely as if you'd pushed her yourself." He took a step closer, his face a mask of grief and rage. "This isn't about land, Red Hawk. It's about retribution. I am going to take everything from you, just as you took everything from my sister. That locket, it was just the appetizer. The main course is watching your new life burn to the ground with your new mail-order bride inside it. The world tilted under Tom's feet. This was not a feud. It was a vendetta born from a twisted grief aimed at a man who hadn't even known the depth of the wound he had unintentionally inflicted. And now that vendetta was aimed squarely at Lily. The ride back to the ranch was a frantic, desperate race against the setting sun. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like Silas Thorne's chilling laughter. Tom's mind churned with the revelation. Eleanor. He remembered her now, her shy smiles, the way she had looked at him with an intensity that had made him uncomfortable. He had been a fool, a young man so focused on his own future with Maria that he had been blind to the fragile heart he held in his hands. He had not meant to break it, but he had. And now, years later, her brother had come to collect the debt with interest. He burst into the cabin, his chest heaving. Lily was there, the Winchester resting across her lap, her face etched with worry. Tom. What happened? He told her everything, the words spilling out in a torrent. The name Thorne, the story of Eleanor, the all-consuming vengeance that was driving Silas. Lily listened without interruption, her riverstone eyes fixed on his. When he was finished, she didn't recoil or accuse him. She simply stood up and placed a hand on his arm. This isn't your fault, Tom. A man can't be blamed for a woman's broken heart, especially one he never intended to win. But he blames me. Tom said, his voice raw. And he'll make you pay for it. Then we will face him together. She said, her voice a bedrock of certainty in his swirling chaos. Her strength was his anchor. But Silas Thorne was not a man to be faced on an open field. He was a serpent who struck from the shadows. The attacks escalated, becoming more personal, more cruel. They found one of their best milk cows slaughtered in the field, a note pinned to its hide with a skinning knife. She loved you. You butchered her. The barn fire was next. They were woken in the dead of night by the frantic whinnying of the horses. Flames were licking up the dry timber walls, casting a demonic orange glow against the night sky. For a desperate hour they fought the blaze side by side, a frantic bucket brigade against a roaring inferno. They saved the animals in the main structure, but the hayloft and half the roof were gone, reduced to smoldering ash. They collapsed by the well, gasping for air, their faces black with soot, the smell of burnt hope stinging their nostrils. He wants to break us. Lily choked out, coughing. To peel away everything we've built piece by piece. Tom knew she was right. Silas wasn't just trying to drive them out anymore. He was enjoying the slow destruction of Tom's world. This was his performance, his tribute to his sister's memory. The final blow came on a day when Tom had ridden out to the far pastures, tracking a stray calf. He'd been gone longer than he intended, a gnawing anxiety growing with every passing minute. When he rode back into the yard, a terrifying stillness greeted him. The cabin door was ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. Lily. He called, his voice tight with dread as he swung down from his horse. There was no answer. He drew his Colt and entered the cabin cautiously. A chair was overturned. A bowl of dough Lily had been kneading sat on the table, a small dent in its surface, where her hand had been abruptly pulled away. And on the floor in the center of the room was a single perfect white rose, Eleanor's favorite flower. Tucked into its stem was a note. To the old Silver Queen mine, sunset. Come alone, or the next flower you see will be on her grave. Let us finish what you started. Ice flooded Tom's veins. He had been so focused on protecting the ranch, the physical manifestation of his life, that he had failed to protect its heart. Silas had taken her. He had taken Lily. The stakes were no longer about land or the past. They were about the future, a future that was now bound and gagged in the hands of a madman. The Silver Queen mine was a scar on the face of the mountain, a place whispered about by locals, abandoned for 50 years and said to be unstable. As Tom rode toward it, the sky bled from orange to a bruised purple. A sandstorm was brewing on the horizon, a churning wall of brown dust that was swallowing the distant mesas. The wind was rising, howling through the canyons, with a mournful, hungry sound. It was a fitting stage for a final act. He dismounted at the entrance to the mine, the wind tearing at his clothes, the air thick with grit. The groaning of old timbers from within the mine shaft sounded like the mountain itself was in pain. He left his horse and entered the darkness, his Colt a cold, heavy weight in his hand. The air inside was stale, smelling of damp earth and decay. Thorn. He yelled, his voice swallowed by the vast, oppressive blackness and the rising shriek of the storm outside. A lantern flared to life, deep within the tunnel, casting long, dancing shadows. Silas Thorn stood there, a silhouette against the flickering light. Beside him, tied to a support beam, was Lily. Her face was bruised, her lips split, but her eyes, when they found Tom's, were filled with defiance, not fear. "Welcome, Mr. Redhawk." Silas called out, his voice echoing unnaturally in the confined space. "I trust your ride was appropriately grim." "Let her go, Thorn." Tom said, his voice a low growl. "This is between you and me." "Oh, but that's where you're wrong," Silas said, stepping closer to Lily and running a gloved finger along her jaw. Lily flinched, but did not cry out. "She is what this is between. She is the life you tried to build on my sister's grave. An eye for an eye, a love for a love." The storm hit the mouth of the mine with the force of a physical blow. Dust and sand billowed into the tunnel, momentarily extinguishing the lantern. In the sudden pitch-black chaos, Tom lunged forward, using his knowledge of the dark, his Apache senses screaming to life. The fight was a brutal, desperate affair in the swirling dust and intermittent darkness. It was not a clean fight of fists and bullets, but a primal struggle of grappling bodies of grunts and curses lost in the howl of the wind. Tom could hear Lily shouting encouragement, her voice a lifeline in the maelstrom. He landed a solid blow, sending Silas stumbling back against a pile of loose rock. The lantern, which Silas had relit, fell and rolled its light, spinning crazily across the cavern walls. In that flickering, hellish light, Silas came up smiling, a bloody gash on his forehead. "You fight like an animal," he spat. "Just as she said you would." He lunged, a knife appearing in his hand. Tom sidestepped the blade, slicing through his sleeve. He drove his shoulder into Silas's chest, slamming him against the very beam Lily was tied to. The old timber groaned in protest. "You mourn a woman I killed for you." Silas screamed, his face inches from Tom's, his eyes wild with madness and triumph. "That beam in the corral, it was meant for your leg, Redhawk, a warning to cripple you, to make you suffer. But your precious Maria was in the wrong place at the wrong time. An accident born from my hatred for you." The world stopped. The howling of the wind, the creak of the mine, the pounding of his own heart, it all faded away to a deafening roars in his ears. Maria's death was not an accident. It was murder. A botched attempt at vengeance that had claimed the wrong victim. The grief and guilt he had carried for 6 years was recast, twisted into something monstrous. A pure, white-hot rage unlike anything he had ever known consumed him. This was not for Eleanor anymore. This was for Maria. He wrapped his hands around Silas Thorn's throat, squeezing the man's life fluttering beneath his thumbs. He could end it. Right here. He could crush the source of all his pain and be done. "Tom, no," Lily's voice cut through his rage. Don't become him. He looked at her. Her face, even bruised and battered, was filled with a desperate plea. She was right. Killing Silas would be vengeance, not justice. It would make him a murderer, the very thing he now knew Silas to be. It would poison the future they were trying to build, the future for the child he now realized, with a sudden gut-wrenching certainty, she was carrying. He saw it in the protective way she held herself, in the fierce hope in her eyes. With a guttural cry of anguish and release, he slammed Silas's head against the beam, hard enough to render him unconscious, but not dead. As Silas slumped to the ground, Tom leaned against the rough wall of the mine, gasping for air, the sandstorm raging outside and the storm inside his soul beginning finally to quiet. He went to Lily and with trembling hands cut her free. She fell into his arms, and they held each other as the timbers of the Silver Queen mine groaned around them, threatening to bury the past once and for all. They emerged from the mine into the dying fury of the sandstorm, leading a dazed and bound Silas Thorne. The ride to Rimrock was a grim, silent procession. Tom delivered Thorne to Sheriff Brody, along with the story of his confession. Brody, seeing the state of Lily and the crazed look in Thorne's eyes, locked him in a cell without question. "Looks like Rimrock's getting downright literary," the sheriff muttered, shaking his head. "An Apache, a mail-order bride, and a ghost with a silver tongue." Back at the ranch, the silence was different. It was not empty, but filled with the weight of all that had happened. They tended to their wounds, Lily cleaning the gash on Tom's arm, Tom gently dabbing a cool cloth on the bruise on her cheek. The physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional wreckage. That night, sitting before the fire, Tom finally broke. The dam of his long-held grief and guilt shattered. He told Lily everything. He told her about Eleanor, about his youthful blindness, the guilt he had carried for her death, a guilt now dwarfed by the horrifying truth of Maria's murder. He confessed the darkness he'd felt in the mine, the raw desire to kill Silas with his bare hands. He laid his soul bare, expecting her to see the monster Silas claimed he was. Lily listened, her gaze never leaving his face. When he finished his voice, a raw whisper, she moved closer and took his hands in hers. They were strong hands, capable of breaking horses and building barns, and nearly of taking a life. "The man I saw in that mine was not a monster, Tom," she said softly. "He was a man fighting for his wife and his future. The choice you made to show mercy when he showed none, that is what defines you. Not your past, not his hatred. That choice." Her acceptance was a balm on his wounded spirit. In the crucible of violence and fear, their bond had been forged into something unbreakable. He was no longer just a man she lived with. He was the man she had fought beside the man she had saved from his own darkness. And he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that she was the woman he loved. He pulled her gently to him, burying his face in her hair, and for the first time since Maria's death, he wept. He wept for the wife he had lost, for the truth he had never known, and for the second chance he never thought he deserved, a chance that was now curled up safely in his arms. Their shared trauma, their survival, had solidified them. They were no longer two separate people learning to live together. They were one scarred but whole. Months passed. The seasons turned. The scars on the land and on their hearts began to heal. The barn was rebuilt stronger than before. Silas Thorne was tried and sent to the territorial prison in Yuma, his name fading into a cautionary tale told in Rimrock's saloon. The ranch, once a place of siege, became a sanctuary of peace. Lily's belly grew round and full, a beautiful living promise of the future. Tom watched over her with a fierce, tender protectiveness. He finished the second room of the cabin, the one with the window facing east to catch the morning sun. He planed the boards smooth and carved the beams with care, building a cradle from the wood of a lightning-felled pine. One crisp autumn evening, as the aspens in the high country blazed gold, Tom took Lily's hand. "There's somewhere I need to go," he said, "and I want you to come with me." He led her up the hill above the cabin to the lone oak tree, whose branches spread wide against the deepening twilight sky. A simple wooden cross marked the spot. "This is where Maria lies," he said quietly. Lily laid her hand gently on the rough bark of the tree. He had told her the whole story, and she understood. Reaching into his pocket, Tom pulled out the small, tarnished silver locket. Sheriff Brody had recovered it from Thorne's possessions and returned it to him. He had held on to it, unsure of what to do with this ghost from a life that felt a world away. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He knew the tiny, faded portrait inside. He stepped forward and gently placed the locket on the wooden cross, letting it rest against the weathered wood. He spoke, his voice low, carried on the cool evening breeze, not just to the memory of the woman buried beneath the soil, but to the ghosts that had haunted him for so long. "Maria," he began, "he's gone. The man who did this. There is justice. And Eleanor, I am sorry. May you both find peace." He paused, taking a deep breath, the air clean and sharp. "And Maria, thank you. For everything. For this land. For the memory of your laughter." He turned back to Lily, his gaze steady and clear. "Without her, none of this would exist. And without you." He said, his voice thick with emotion, as he placed a hand on her swollen belly. "It would mean nothing." Lily's eyes shone with unshed tears. "When our child is grown," she said softly, "we'll bring them here. We'll tell them about the woman who first helped build this home. They'll know this land was built by many hands, by love and by loss." Tom swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. "Yes," he said, "they'll know." He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. He gave the grave one last look, a final quiet goodbye. Then he turned his back on the past, on the sorrow and the vengeance, and walked with his wife toward the warm, glowing light of their cabin, toward the cries of a new life waiting to be born. The land around them was vast and unyielding, but for the first time, it felt not like a place of solitude, but of profound and lasting peace. He was home.